My name is Jason Alari. I'm the Executive Director of the Historical Society. And I just have a few announcements before we get started with Sam's talk. Right off the bat, I want to thank our sponsors to help make all this possible. We have 4 sponsors for today's talk: Mel and Linda Mills, Dean and Judith Schultz, Doris Hall, and Peggy Ricker. If you're in the room, can you please raise your hand if you're a sponsor? Thank you. Thank you very much. Laura Bankert, our Outreach and Events Director, asked me to make some announcements about upcoming events. Mark your calendar, October 19th, coming up this weekend, our Halloween event. It's a family-friendly event. It's going to be in Cocky's Tavern from 4 to 6. Also, our annual meeting of the membership on October 29th. Tickets are selling fast. I think we're close to 60 in attendance already. We're going to have a great speaker. And that is going to be 11:30. The doors open. It's going to be at the Best Western in Westminster, October 29th, the Society's annual meeting. You can sign up online. And our next BLT in November, Larry Villette, Early History of Mount Airy, will be our November BLT. And with that, I'm going to introduce our speaker, Sam Riley. Sam is president of the Union Mills Homestead Foundation. We are thankful for his lifelong interest in history, which has led to interesting box lunch talks in the past and many articles for the Carroll History Journal. Sam is a Maryland attorney focusing on civil litigation and regulatory matters. He earned his JD from the University of Maryland School of Law. After a 30-year dual military career, Sam retired as a colonel in the Maryland National Guard. Sam's mother, many of you know, Helen Riley, was recipient of the Society's Distinguished Service Award for her amazing work for the Historical Society spanning decades. Sam's home, Farm Content, is on the National Register of Historic Places and this year received a Maryland Historic Trust roadside marker. Can we have a warm round of applause for Sam?
Thank you, Jason, for those kind words. And I appreciate everyone's coming out, being here today, and listening to some conversation about taverns. So this presentation is a spin-off of some ongoing research we've been doing at Union Mills, directed to the complex history of that site. And as you might guess, that history includes a period of time where Union Mills was a tavern. Taverns were an important part of 18th and 19th century American life. And it's a story I hope to tell today with a focus on taverns in what is now Carroll County. Obviously, most of what I'll be talking about relates to Frederick County, but I'll be directing most of my comments to the areas that are now Carroll County. The story is more than just the function that these establishments performed. You know, it's more than just a place where people went to get a drink. And it's really a portrait of our nation's early history. And in fact, taverns were really in many ways, we can't imagine, from our perspective in the 21st century, a crossroads of American life in an earlier era. This image behind me is that of the Isaac Shriver Tavern. In an earlier era, it was Jacob Sherman Tavern, later was known as the Main Court Inn. They're on Main Street in Westminster, right at the county seat. In fact, right at the courthouse at Court Street and Main Street. It was a pretty good location for a tavern. So if you could advance to the next slide, please. I sort of figured that I was asked to do this talk not because I knew anything about history, but maybe because the word got around I'd been a regular at a few local establishments, imbibing some microbrews or other beverages. And and perhaps that particularized knowledge was something that would help with this topic. And I think there's some truth to that. And so I thought it was important to dedicate this talk to all those who have shared some fellowship in a tavern over the years, going back in time. It's amazing how much you can get done, how much you can get to know folks when you have a drink in your hand and where everyone knows your name. And in particular, I'd like to recognize one of the fellows that we used to see every Wednesday at a local establishment by the name of Jason Kinnear, who passed earlier this year. So the next slide, please. There's a lot of material today, and I'll try to get through it without being a carnival barker and also without taking too much time. But this is an outline of the material if it helps to organize it any as we go through. The next slide. So for those of you who are not Chevy Chase fans, I'll apologize for the National Lampoon reference, but many of us grew up with Chevy Chase's humor and associate the Griswold family with kind of the typical American vacation. And not too dissimilar to today, in the 18th and 19th centuries, Americans were on the move. There was a lot of travel back in those days, and when folks travel, they need a place to eat and drink. Next slide. So this 1794 Griffith map of Maryland is quite handy to discuss early taverns in Carroll County. It's one of my favorite maps. It's pretty neat because it shows not just waterways and roads in what is now Carroll County, but it also shows taverns. And we'll go through some of those just because I think it is helpful to kind of get a sense of where they were located and how many there were. Travel, of course, meant roads. You had to get on a road to get somewhere. And of course, good roads really didn't exist until about the turn of the 19th century, really, most roads were just trails. They were trails that had been established by Native Americans over millennia, and then over time got expanded when European settlers got here into wagon roads. And so in those early days, stagecoaches didn't really exist outside of cities. So when you were traveling particularly earlier in the 18th century, you were traveling by horse or by pack horse trains. But of course there were still taverns, because where there were people traveling, they needed a place to stop. Some of the earliest taverns, next slide, in Carroll County were in Frederick and, in Tawnytown, and you'll see that big red dot there on Tawnytown, and it is an important place to start this conversation because that neat little town is located right at an intersection, one of the most important intersections in what is now Carroll County in the 18th century. It is located on the Monocacy Road, a road that connected the Susquehanna to the Monocacy River, and right there at the intersection of two major roads, there were 4 taverns at the corner there at the square, 4 taverns located in Tawnytown at the square. Over time, you go through the records, there were just scores of taverns located in and around Tawnytown over the years. It's really a talk in and of itself that would need quite a bit of research, but it is fascinating. And as you look at some of them, some of the stories are just incredible. We know the story, of course, of the Adam Good Tavern, which was located there in Tawnytown, which hosted the President of the United States, George Washington, for a night in 1791. And thanks to Sue Bloom's research, we now know that they also hosted Thomas Jefferson in 1776 on a trip to Philadelphia, where he wrote the Declaration of Independence. So you just have this kind of neat byway that, in our 21st century perspective, we don't really think of that town as being on a major byway, but in that era it certainly was, and long before the other municipalities and areas in what is now Carroll County. So as you go through on that road, the Monocacy Road, there was a number of other taverns located there, and we'll just go through these, and if you go to the next slide. all along the route, and then the next slide, and the next slide, you'll see that there were taverns located all along that road. You'd advance 2 more, please. You'll see all the way up to Petersburg, which is now Littlestown, of course, there were taverns. And there were other taverns located along there also over time. The reason I put Petersburg up there, even though it's certainly outside of Carroll County and outside the state, is that the proprietor in the 1790s of the tavern in Littlestown in Petersburg was none other than Andrew Shriver. Union Mills didn't exist yet, and that was his first real business gig. He had a tavern and was the postmaster there in Petersburg. So as we go through and look at, again, where the rest of these taverns are located, next slide, and then the next slide, and the next slide, and the next slide, the next slide, and the next slide, you see that what's now Route 30 heading up towards Hanover was just chock full of taverns. And you can see kind of where they fall on a major thoroughfare. And the same thing as we go through the other major roads of that era. Next slide. Starting down in Finksburg, heading out of Reisterstown, and next slide, and next slide, next slide, and next slide. You see that route from Finksburg on up through Westminster and then through to Petersburg, but not up through what we now know as Route 97, Littlestown Pike, but up what essentially was the old road, which was probably a combination of Stone Road and what's now Arters Mill Road up to Littlestown before that road got changed. And then if we'll kind of do the same thing again, next slide, and next slide, next slide, next slide, and next slide, and one more, please. You'll see that what was the what's we call now Route 26, the Liberty Road, had just a host of taverns located along that route, starting on this map at least with Welsh's Tavern, which was located at the intersection of 26, well, what's now 26 and 32. So again, you can see that there was this very active collection of taverns all along the route. And I put Liberty Town also on here, even though it's not a Carroll County town, just because we're going to talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. So all of these taverns, with perhaps a few exceptions, were 18th century taverns that reflected an earlier and maybe more traditional notion of roadside hospitality. Artistic depictions of taverns in that era reflected this idea of life being simple and yet romantic. This painting by a French-born painter, Philippe Jacques de Lothenburg, is typical of the romanticism of the era, called The Rainbow, also known as Travelers Outside the Bull Inn with a Rainbow in the Sky, dates to 1784. And it just gives you a sense of this idea in the 18th century of this kind of romantic notion surrounding taverns. Next slide. And so too in this watercolor by Paul Sandby of A Wayside Inn, depicting a traveler along a country road. There's a wayside inn, there's a family assisting a drunken man, but there's also just a single traveler that's going through. Very kind of quiet sort of depiction of life in the 18th century. So a good local example of that type of tavern would be at Welsh's Tavern down in, again, in Eldersburg, what's now 26 and 32. As English, Scots, and Welsh came up from southern Maryland and settled this part of the country, they were establishing businesses and farms and so forth. And this is typical of that era, founded along what was then called the Great Road or the Diggs Wagon Road. And this was a really important stop. This is an early tavern and a very important stop on that early route between Baltimore and Frederick. It was a midpoint between those two important locations, and it was a great place to stop at a midway point if you were traveling and needed a place for the night. I should comment on this that this word tavern, even the word tavern is almost something that we don't quite understand, because we think of a tavern as a bar. a place where you go to get a drink. In the 18th and 19th centuries, taverns were much more than that. They were a place that you went to for to rest, to recover, to have food, drink, and to spend the night. Typically, all those were services that were offered at a roadside tavern. Next slide. Things changed at about the turn of the 19th century in what we would now call the Turnpike era. And this is a slide I've used in previous presentations of the Reisterstown Road, the Baltimore-Reisterstown Turnpike that connected Baltimore to both Littlestown and to Hanover. And it's a pretty good example of kind of how these turnpikes developed, leading out from Baltimore City to Maryland's Piedmont area. Other turnpikes, next slide, you see here are the Frederick Road, and next slide, the York Road, and also later the Liberty Turnpike. So next slide, please. So you see all these roads leading out from Baltimore. They also led into Baltimore, and so along these routes was just this incredible amount of traffic that was pouring into and out of the city with human traffic, with lots of freight traffic, and with droves of sheep and turkeys and other animals being led into the city, and also wagons full of whiskey, and flour. So there was a lot of trade going. It was a very active environment. Next slide, please. So this painting of the Fairview Inn by Thomas Coke Ruckle dates to the heyday of the Turnpike era, circa about 1827. And the Fairview Inn was located on the Old Frederick Road, also known as the 3 Mile House, so it was pretty close into Baltimore. It was a great place to stop if you were making your final stop into Baltimore, or maybe your first stop out of Baltimore. But you get some sense from this artistic rendition of what a Turnpike tavern looked like in that era. It's a much different feel with lots of hustle and bustle and lots of traffic. Comparisons, again, to the modern era are difficult, but maybe a better example for us might be a service area along a toll road where you might be able to spend the night. Next slide. So the Franklin Tavern along the Liberty Turnpike west of Eldersburg is another example of one of these taverns that sprung up in the Turnpike era. This quaint photo that was taken a century later gives you some sense of what this establishment looked like, but you can imagine just how busy this tavern was with all the traffic that was moving along the Liberty Turnpike in that era. Next slide. So, Catherine Sitchelman captured the rapidly changing face of Westminster in her diary, which is a good read if you've never been through it, describing Westminster in the decade from 1822 to 1832. She described 100 buildings in the town of Westminster, 5 of which were taverns. Other than dry goods stores and groceries, taverns and cooper shops were the top businesses in town, 5 each, followed by blacksmiths, tanyards, and doctors, 4 each. So you get a sense that there was a lot of activity and a lot of traffic coming through Westminster, and it truly did change the face of the town rapidly. It changed the entire county. The Turnpike era it really advanced the rate of change in so many different ways. Isaac Shriver took over his tavern from Jacob Sherman, who had established his business in Westminster's earliest days. And so that was, the Isaac Shriver Tavern was one of the more established older taverns in town, but there was just a bunch of new businesses that opened over time, and there were more businesses in the decades that followed. Next slide. So there were taverns everywhere. There's still so much research to be done on this topic. If anybody wants something fun to do, it's just never ending, the amount of research that is still out there to be done. This is a nugget that was found by Jeff Duvall, captured about Dill's Tavern. He was helping me do research on tanneries, and there was some mistaken notation that this was a tannery, and in fact, it turned out it was a tavern. in Silver Run, located right at the intersection of 97 and Silver Run Valley Road. Jeff located this by some research in wills and found Nicholas Dill's will, if I can get that out. And anyway, so you get this idea that, again, there were taverns just about everywhere. Along the National Road and Turnpike between Philadelphia and along the National Road in Maryland and along the Turnpike between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, there are really good records as to the number of taverns. In most, along I guess they called it in those days the Pennsylvania Turnpike, which we still call it today, there were stops just about every mile that you could, there was a tavern almost every milestone. Thomas Seawright, who chronicled the Old Pike, the history of the National Road, recorded at least 300 inns and taverns between Baltimore and Wheeling in the Turnpike era. So you can imagine just how much business that was to ensure that all of those establishments remained open. Next slide. So I know you can't read this slide, but I wanted to include it. Again, this is a pretty good slide, and it's available. It'll be online when this makes it on YouTube, I guess, in the future. But for those who want to dig further, again, this is another Jeff Duval project. He pulled together a list of all the taverns from the 1837 Carroll County tax records. So there are 28 of these listed, and it's just fascinating. This is just one snippet in time of taverns in Carroll County, and again, there were scores more that existed in different eras and different times. Interesting on this is in 1837, Andrew Shriver is not listed on this list. His brother Isaac still is listed. In the 1835 tax list, Andrew Shriver is listed. So it gives some sense that maybe that was about the time that Andrew Shriver was shutting down his tannery, or excuse me, his inn and tavern to focus on other businesses like the tannery and mill. Next slide. So to change focus a little bit, I put these lyrics up from the Marvelettes in their 1961 hit to kind of give you the sense that, as I think you know, everybody likes to get mail. And there's just this deep human desire for information that we all have. It's just a universal desire for information. And in that sort of, with that background, taverns really became a centerpiece of American culture in the 19th century, as they ended up really to play a key part in the transfer of information in our early history. Next slide. You can't really have this conversation without talking about the Post Office Act of 1792. This was one of the most important early pieces of legislation in our history, and kind of cool. It was signed into law by President George Washington on February 20th, 1792. And when you look at the actual legislation, it says right down at the bottom that, also on the list of, the people who prepared the legislation, it says John Adams, the vice president, who was also the president of the Senate, and the Secretary of State, who was Thomas Jefferson. So it was just kind of cool to see all that. Kind of one of those little finds like Sue found when she was researching Thomas Jefferson's trip in 1776. But this law was the first major postal law in our history and established the foundation of the modern postal service, authorized the construction of postal roads, and really greatly advanced the transfer of information. Next slide. One of the ways that was accomplished, by the way, I don't expect you all to read all this either, but it's just to kind of illustrate the legislation. Newspapers, fascinating, were given special treatment under the statute. And in fact, they were given special rates to ensure that information got disseminated quickly. So it was actually cheaper in many instances to ship newspapers than it was to ship a letter. It was that important to our early founders that information be shared. One of the neat quotes, it's actually not so much a cool quote anymore because this quote has now been removed from the U.S. Postal Service Museum, but it was a quote by John C. Calhoun who of course has a rather challenging history in his politics of that era. But he was very early in U.S. Congress, before in the House of Representatives, long before he got into the hold higher office. But he recognized how important this was when he urged Congress to bind the Republic together with a perfect system of roads and canals. It is thus that a citizen of the West will read the news of Boston still moist from the press. The mail and the press are the nerves of the body politic. And really that does sum up very well just how important information was and how important how significant it was that our early leaders recognized that and helped facilitate the exchange of information. Next slide. So almost immediately after this new legislation was passed, there were RFPs, requests for proposals, to use the full term, that were issued by the U.S. government for services for the distribution of mail. I think anybody who's been on the highways, you've seen those big tractor trailers that say U.S. mail on the side, or maybe they don't say it so prominently, but the U.S. government has been contracting for transport of mail since the founding of the Republic. These RFPs are really neat to look at because I was trying to find some that were particularly relevant to some of my research at Union Mills. This was the first request for proposal that included Union Mills. This RFP says that it is asking for somebody who's willing to carry, interested in a contract for the carriage of mail through Carroll County, well, through what was then Frederick County, via Winchester and Union Mills, and up to locations in Pennsylvania. This was once a week. In 1803, it was only once a week. Interesting, some of the details in this document. First of all, there were penalties for late delivery of mail. They had to be on time. Secondly, newspapers as well as letters had to be carried through the mails. The mail could be carried through a stage, if you had a stage line. However, that had to be specified in the actual proposal. And finally, of note, no one other than a free white person could be employed to carry the mail. Next slide. So, Baltimore City directories are another really good source to use in trying to find out what was going on with the delivery of mail and how it was progressing over time. The 1814-1815 directory shows mail flowing 3 times a week through Westminster from Baltimore. And then by 1819, it's not just, next slide, it's not just the 3 times a week, but this is interesting. It actually specified the time. Mail had to get through to Chambersburg in 15 hours. So as this request states, it's 85 miles from Baltimore to Chambersburg. And if you do the math, that comes up to about 5.6 miles per hour, which is a pretty fast rate for a stage. Typically, a coach, horse-drawn carriage, would average between, say, 10 to 30 miles a day. This was a lot of work for these teams, and surely they were switching horses out in between. It was pretty amazing, though, that you could mail a letter in Baltimore and have it be in Chambersburg the same day. Next slide. So, with the development of the mails, there's also this expansion into stages. Of course, there was this effort to, there was new roads, there was information being exchanged, there were mail stages, there were other stages as well. So a variety of stage lines ran over the same routes such that there was a stage every day that brought you through these towns in Carroll County, what was then Frederick County. Interesting, one of the lines was even an oyster stage carrying oysters out west. That was how important the oysters were in that era. Next slide. So this Keenan's 1822 to 1823 Baltimore directory for the U.S. mails has got a pretty neat image on it of a horse-drawn carriage, which is kind of neat. But It's also got some information on it that is helpful in kind of expanding upon the idea that not every coach was a mail coach. This was a United States mail coach, so you knew that it was, I guess, a particularly reliable way of transportation. Next slide. The other thing was you knew that you're on a mail coach that was going to be stopping at a post office, which meant that it was a good source of information because each of those stops became post offices along the route. This is an interesting note here on this particular item, talking about the mail coach that goes from Baltimore up through to Chambersburg, goes all the way on to Pittsburgh and Wheeling at this point, and it departs at 3 a.m. For those of you who aren't early risers, that might not be the best deal. Next slide. The types of stages were expanding rapidly. They were not just going out through to the main kind of target of most of the major westward movement of goods and people out towards Pittsburgh, but also to other locations. This is a stage line that went from Baltimore to Hagerstown through Westminster and Taneytown. So again, you see that there was just a lot of different activity, a lot of different stages, going in a lot of different directions. Next slide. So again, I don't expect you all to be able to read this one, but it is a really neat slide, and it's kind of cool because again, we've kind of developed this idea that you stayed overnight, you had something to drink, you had something to eat, and that's what a tavern did. Well, it was so much more. So this was where you paid your taxes in 1831. So this is from the Fredericktown Herald, 1831. It lists 16 locations in Frederick County for the payment of taxes. Of those 16 locations, 14 were taverns. So you knew that a tavern was a pretty important place if you had to get your property taxes paid. It specified what the rates were and when the guy was there, and you better show up to pay them because then, as we all know, bad things happen. It's been that way since the beginning. So Andrew Shriver at Union Mills had things figured out pretty well because he was not just a miller and tanner. He had this tavern going. He was also the postmaster, and he was the justice of the peace. So he had kind of a pretty good deal going, and so not only did you have this dynamic that there was public space for the exchange of information and to get your mail and all this other activity, to have a meal and a drink, well, they had to hold court proceedings too. So that had to be held. Now, Andrew had some strong opinions on this. And in fact, there are early legislation where it was mandated that these court proceedings would happen in a tavern. Andrew didn't like that idea, and he wrote a letter in 1821 saying that he had to have an office separately in his home to hold court proceedings because he felt it was disgraceful to the last degree to see a magistrate sitting in the bar room of a pitiful tippling house surrounded by a number of noisy, drunken characters swearing and cursing. So you can see, though, that maybe he exercised some good judgment in the situation. Other justices of the peace, probably not so much. And then finally, when we talk about all these activities in the taverns, it was, again, not just a place to do all these other activities, but finally, and probably most importantly, it was a place to vote. So there was just a hodgepodge of just about everything, and truly the tavern was the center of community. Next slide. So again, wayside inns or taverns sprang up all along the routes where early roads were, particularly roads that were improved into turnpikes. And we talked about Andrew Shriver. This is Andrew Shriver's property, the Union Mills homestead that he founded with his brother. You see the center portion of the house in the center there, where the that center porch is, and the section that's facing closest to you is the section that was added on in the 1820s to serve this tavern business. So we've learned quite a bit of information in some recent research projects we've had going about the extent of the tavern business, and it is with a separate entrance there. We've pretty much narrowed on this is the tavern that Andrew Shriver built in the 1820s. The date is pretty clear, and we knew he had a tavern, but it's just kind of neat to see that, the kind of the progressing understanding of not just the nature of that tavern business, but where it was located. Again, as taverns were expanding and developing, there was not just more taverns, but more businesses being offered in taverns. And one of the quintessential things that you always needed to do was to get the meal. And so, next slide, please. This is a view of the interior of Andrew Shriver's tavern room as it looks today, and it gives you some sense of that large public space with the large table in the middle around which folks could enjoy their meal. Next slide, please. So that brings us to this 1814 John Lewis Krimmel painting entitled Village Tavern, which gives you a sense of what a traveler on a turnpike might experience upon arriving at a crossroads community like Union Mills. This painting combines a bunch of different themes that are important to any discussion about taverns. And certainly there's drink. You see plenty of drink right on that table and around the folks and behind them at the bar. Krimmel was one of the first genre painters of the New Republic when in our early days, and he does a really good job capturing, in some respects, something that's very simple, but there's so much more. There's a lot going on in this painting, and it's kind of cool to look at it and think about it. Dead center, you see a man having a drink, and right there, kind of accosting him, is a woman and a child. And you can almost imagine some poor wife saying, "Dear, you've got to come home." And then to the right, you see the older gentleman with a newspaper. Not everybody read. Matter of fact, not a large percentage of the population probably couldn't read or couldn't read well. So reading papers aloud was a very central way, a core way of exchanging information. And you see that gentleman there reading from the news. Behind them all on the wall are various bits they're kind of hard to see unless you really look at the painting carefully, but you see all kinds of information posted on the wall. And that was typical in a tavern. And it had to do with all sorts of things. It could be something as simple as a foreclosure or any other legal notice that was posted. But then on the far left-hand side, you see something really important. And it's kind of hidden, but you see the stage that's come up outside this tavern room. And coming in through the door is essentially the mailman. There's a postal carrier there with the mail over his back, and then on to his right, a little bit lower, is a bag of newspapers. So you have all this information, all this colliding in this great piece of art that was done back in the Turnpike era, which is just kind of cool. But one thing there's two things that's missing from this painting, and the fact that they are missing is almost instructive. First of all, there's no African Americans in the picture, in the painting, and secondly, there's no food. There's no kitchen. At this point, they're sharing a drink, and there's this whole bit of information being exchanged. Next slide. So this is the kitchen at Union Mills, and it gives you some sense of this kind of massive fireplace and kitchen array that's needed to serve a tavern of that sort. And this type of kitchen would have been present at just about every tavern. And so you get this idea of lots of food coming into an establishment, and that's certainly how life was in that era. But really the question is, who was in the kitchen? Typically, in a turnpike tavern of that era, it would have been staffed by African Americans. In the instance of the Union Mills Tavern, they were enslaved. And so this was a fairly typical experience of turnpike travelers. They would often describe not just their experiences, but the the situation of those who were African American and were serving them or cooking for them. Next slide. So Louis Dielman was not just a proprietor in a later era of New Windsor's Dielman Inn, but he was a photographer. And this is just, he took a bunch of really powerful photographs. I didn't put the thing on the bottom, but this is from the New Windsor Heritage and their collection. It's absolutely incredible that this has been preserved. Just capturing this image of African-American life surrounding the Dielman Inn. And you get some sense of the type of work and the type of condition of an African-American family in their effort to supply services, labor to the travelers at a tavern. Interestingly, even though the mail did not allow African-American employees, there were African-American drivers of Conestoga wagons. And some of them were fairly well known as being very successful. There were also African-American drovers, people who were bringing livestock into the city. So you know that there were travelers along these turnpikes who were African-American, and there's not a whole lot of information about how they were accommodated in terms of where they slept. You can imagine it wasn't that great. We're talking a little bit about how it wasn't so great for the white folk. You can imagine it was even worse for the black folk. There are some tavern ledgers that do record sales to African American customers. So it is clear that they were traveling up and down these roads. And what's particularly interesting is that Maryland and its location, particularly here in Carroll County, adjoining Pennsylvania, you know that these routes certainly also routes for those who were freedom seekers seeking to find their freedom, had left their enslavers and were seeking freedom along the Underground Railroad. So there is certainly much, much more history still to be found, and there are many nuggets, I'm sure, in boxes and attics all across the area, just waiting to be uncovered. So, next slide. These lyrics from Les Mis, it may make you smile, but from accounts of the era, it's probably not too far from some of the truth that you would find if you were to experience tavern life. Suffice it to say, quality was hit or miss. I've got some personal accounts that we'll go through briefly, but anyway, there you go. Next slide. First of all, to get from one place or another, you had to travel. And of course, horseback was one way. Stage seemed to be maybe a better way, but although it seemed romantic, it was often tiring and it was dirty. Charles Augustus Murray, in his travels in North America, said of these coaches, "When taken, to be well shaken." And these roads, of course, we imagine roads being what we know as roads today. They were nothing like it. They were rough journeys. Even improved roads of those days were rough journeys. One neat account was done by Andrew Shriver in a letter from his, when he was going into Washington. He sent this letter in 1811 to his wife Betsy, and he described, "I arrived at this place on Saturday evening after a very unpleasant trip in the stage, through the worst roads I ever saw, in a weakened state, having had a purging and vomiting on the road that weakened me much." I'm sorry if you're eating still. Next slide. A few days later, Andrew wrote a second letter from Baltimore to his wife, saying the journey from Frederick to Washington and from there here has been intolerable. None of the roads paved and mud up to the axle tree every step. Traveling in a market wagon, quite as expeditious and far more comfortable. So again, you get the sense that the travel itself was rough. Next slide, please. After a difficult trip, you might want to get respite in a tavern, but your experience might not be much better. A New England tavern was described by Francis Underwood as follows: "To one coming from the fresh air without, the breath of that fiery barroom was overpowering. The odors of the hostler's boots, redolent of fish oil and tallow, and of buffalo robes and horse blankets, the latter reminiscent of equine ammonia, almost got the better of the all-pervading fumes of spirits and tobacco. Clay pipes for cut plug were much in favor, although some reckless spendthrifts at times smoked Principe cigars at 3 cents each. This was the exchange for rustic wit, the focus of hate for parsons and deacons, and of ridicule for the newfangled temperance society. The walls were adorned with placards of stage routes, woodcuts of enormous stallions and prancing attitudes, and notices of sheriff sales for the land of some deceased or ruined farmer. So then after you got through the smell, the food and accommodations did not typically get rave reviews either. John May of Boston was traveling by horseback to Ohio in 1788 and 1789, traveled through Winchester on his trip to Pittsburgh. And he says that he lodged the night 30 miles from Baltimore. The accommodations poor, but the provisions worse. Margaret Hall wrote in 1828 from New York State, on a trip from New York State down through the South, "God sends meat and the devil sends cooks," a saying which applies with full force in this country. There is food in abundance, but it is dressed after a manner that is enough to appall even a hungry stomach. And I often find myself skirmishing about amongst the dishes in a vain search after something a little more eatable than the rest. We have found the fare very bad indeed since we left Albany, and large inns or small, it made but little difference. So then you think, well, I'm going to get a good night's sleep. Your room could be the final insult. Now, first of all, everything was done in common. Now, you shared the room, you shared the bed, you shared the space, and I've got a whole bunch of quotes on that. In the interest of time, I'm just going to move on to the good stuff. Isaac Weld in 1794, arriving at a tavern in Virginia, was shown a room about 10 feet square in which were two filthy beds swarming with bugs. Mrs. Hall in 1828 stated about one tavern that that was the most comfortable house we have been in, although there was the usual complement of fleas and bugs. But we have ceased to expect anything else. She continued, "Every night I'm awakened by Mrs. Cowney striking a light to commence her search for her tormentors. We bring them along with us in our clothes, and when I undress, I find them crawling on my skin. Nasty wretches." So, next slide. I think I have had enough of that. So, looking at the bright side, if your food was not so good and your bed was not so good, at least you had something good to wash it down with. In the 18th century, drinking was a big deal. This drinking song reflects just how much drinking of alcoholic beverages was ingrained in American culture. Drink was not just about what people did and what they thought appropriate, but they thought it was healthy too. Telling was a letter from Abraham Shriver to his brother Andrew, instructing on how to ensure a successful political rally, talking about what to cook and all the details. And when it came to the beverages, he said, above all, use nothing but whiskey. Next slide. So I know you can't see this in detail, but it's just a really cool set of ledgers we're going to talk about, hopefully without taking too much more time. Distilled spirits, and in particular rum, were big in the 18th century. They grew in popularity throughout the century. This is a 1787 tavern ledger from the Bernard McSherry Tavern in Liberty Town. And it's fascinating reads. Next slide. When you focus in on the detail, it actually, you see the types of drinks, typically cider and rum. That is the kind of the focus of much of the drinking in the era surrounding the Revolution. Also interesting was not just what they drank, but how they paid for it. Most of this was taken on credit. Tavern owners were bankers. They not just gave you credit on what you drank and what you ate, but they lent you money. They were the bankers in town. Next slide. This is a really cool ledger. Congrats to New Windsor Heritage for what they've done in preserving this. This is a ledger of Emanuel Brower, one portion of it, and this is from 1806 to 1813, if my memory serves me right. By this era, what we drank had dramatically changed. After the Revolution, rum was out for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was the British had basically kept us from importing molasses, and of course there was the decline in the transatlantic trade of the enslaved, which interrupted the flow of molasses. So rum was out, whiskey was in, and you look down at this tavern, it's just amazing how much whiskey was being consumed. Next slide. Not just did they talk about drinking a lot of whiskey, but they had it, some cider too, but they also had a lot of whiskey for breakfast. It's amazing how many times you saw someone get breakfast and whiskey, measured by the gill, or quart in some instances. Next slide. So there's so much more to do with this Emanuel Brower ledger. It's really cool. Congrats to Jeannie Loudermilk for her transcription of it. But I wanted to just go through this quickly. It's worth doing. I basically was able to get the transcription, do just a search through the text for various beverages to see how many orders. There's a lot more research for how much it cost and how many quantities, because a lot of folks are ordering it by the quart. But if you go through this next slide, you get the idea. It's increasing. Lots of drinks, and this is over this period. 3,415 drinks of whiskey, compared to a minuscule amount of rum. If that just doesn't tell the story, there's so much more to be done with this ledger. Congrats again to New Windsor Heritage for the work on it. Now listen, I know many of you date back many generations, and so I won't name names, but there are some interesting stories in this ledger. Like the fella who ordered 2.5 pints of whiskey with his breakfast and was also charged for parts of a window light. I suspect that he got a little bit rowdy and broke something. I'm not going to name names, but you know who you are. Temperance was certainly a developing issue. We all know that drinking too much alcohol has ill effects. I'm running short on time, so I'm going to have to go through this quickly, but government got involved very early on. Next slide. As early as, long before this legislation, the common law provided for the regulation of taverns. And so that existed in English common law even before this legislation. You can see that they were worried not just about things such as licensing, but the legislation included restrictions prohibiting townsmen, craftsmen, and laborers from drinking during the working day or for more than 1 hour, except when they took their diet there. So the legislation throughout talks about the importance of the taverns for the benefit of travelers and strangers, not so much for the local drinkers. Now, we all know what happens, but that was what was intended by the legislation. Next slide. Again, there are lots of taxes that you had to pay. Interesting, you paid it in tobacco in 1704. Next slide. So I know you can't read this, but it's kind of cool. It's a license from Somerset County, but it talks about taverns and ordinaries for the use and conveniency of travelers and strangers. And it said that the licenses were issued so long as the proprietor would keep good rules in order and not suffer idle, loose, or disorderly persons to tipple, game, and commit disorders or other irregularities. So again, some things never change. Next slide. This is a piece of Andrew Shriver's license for when he was a tavern keeper up in Petersburg. And so it again allowed him to sell rum, brandy, beer, ales, and spirituous liquors by the small measure, so long as not to suffer drunkenness or unlawful behavior in his establishment. Next slide. If you broke the rules, you got charged. And these are a series of offenses. This is before the Revolution, or actually during the Revolution. This is 1776. But you see the lordship versus whoever it was for selling liquors without a license. Next slide. Bottom line is a lot of the penalties were assessed in currency. Most were assessed in tobacco. Next slide. I wanted to get through this one if we can, and then I'll take some questions. Interesting, one of the things the legislation allowed was for the courts to set the rates in the taverns. So interesting, this is a 1776 document, which is interesting and is approaching 250th anniversary of our nation. And it goes through the different rates that can be charged for different things in the tavern. And not just for drink or food, but also for oats for your horse, stabling or pasturage, and lodging and a good bed. So next slide. Just takes you around the slide a little bit, and bottom line, lots of choices and lots of different drinks, including all the prices set out right there. Next slide. So real quick point on this, and then I'm going to wrap up. It's interesting that the legislation that was written, yes, they were often worried about people being licensed and things like that. But it's fascinating. The concern in many of these pieces of legislation was the impact on labor. Because as stated in this law, it's a 1774 statute, the concern was that the masters, they were worried about the servants and slaves getting together and drinking. And they were concerned because the masters of such servants and slaves are very much prejudiced by the vice and licentiousness of the crowds assembled. So they wanted you to show up the next day and work and not carouse all night. Next slide. Again, it was illegal for them to get together and carouse, and if you did, you were authorized to be whipped. You could get up to 21, up to, I got it there somewhere. Nope. 20 stripes, there you go. Any person was authorized to whip such servant or slave, not exceeding 20 stripes if they violated the ordinance, the statute. Next slide. I will wrap up here by thanking you for your attention. I know I went through a lot. Bottom line is that taverns blossomed in a rapidly changing time. We think times are changing now, but things were really changing back then. There was a market revolution, a transportation revolution, an information revolution, and so much of that dramatic change took place in this 40-year era of the Turnpike, the heyday of the Turnpike era. And taverns were at the center of all that change. It's a fascinating subject, so much more to be done, and with that, I'll thank you and say, are there any questions if we have time?
Sam, thank you very much. We have two microphones in the room. I'm handing one, and Kyle has on the other side. So if you can put your hand up for questions, that'd be great.
All right, got a question here, Sam. Were there any age restrictions on who could drink from tavern?
Not that I saw.
Sam, first I have two questions. One, did every tavern have to have its own brewery then?
Have a what?
Brewery? I mean, how did they get all this listed?
Distillery. So, first of all, there were very few brewers. There was certainly a brewer in Westminster, but we know that there were a limited number of breweries. I think there was probably some local brewed stuff. I haven't gotten into the research on distillers, so that's the next project for somebody else. But I think that bottom line is it was big business, and there was a lot of whiskey being shipped from the outlying areas of where there was rye and corn and wheat growing, there was whiskey.
Thank you. And the other question is, you mentioned that only white males could be mail carriers. I think you said white males.
If I said males, I might have misspoken. I think it said free white persons, I think is what the legislation said.
Was there a literacy test, or did you get training to
I think there's a lot of good research still to be done, and that's a great question. I think one of the realities is as much of our research is we often have focused on the perspective of those of us who are white, and that is kind of the story we like to tell, and finding some of these stories is difficult, and it's going to take much more research and some finds. Like this Nicholas Brower, or the Emanuel Brower ledger is just an incredible find, and there are other documents out there like that are just chock full of critical first-hand information that will help in understanding stories just like that.
Okay, question here. Give me 1 second to get to you. Mike?
You can hear me, right?
No.
I can. I'm not sure everyone else can.
Are there any structures in the communities of Reese, Carrollton, or Sandy Mount still standing at the taverns that you know?
So one of the bits of research I did not get to was going through how many of these structures are still standing and how many are not. I did that with the tannery research. This project is inviting, it's calling out for someone to dig into it. So, sir, I would love to have you help us try to figure that one out. Many of these are on the inventory of historic properties, and you can figure that out fairly readily. But we know that many are not. For instance, the Adam Good Tavern we know is not standing. Across the street, the Old Stone Tavern still is standing. So many of these structures are, many are not.
What's the date on the trail map that you first showed? Is there a date on that map?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Is there a date on the map that you first showed, the trail map with the towers?
Yeah, that's first map is a 1794 Griffith map. It's available at the Library of Congress. You just type in map of Maryland 1794, it'll come right up. It's a great map.
Thank you. Got a question here.
I grew up in northern Baltimore County, and I'm sorry, I grew up in northern Baltimore County off York Road at Weisburg, and the tavern is still there, and it was halfway between York and Baltimore. It was a stagecoach stop and all the things you just mentioned, and it's still there.
Yeah, each of those roads, I mean, I kind of had to pick the stories, and I limited them to what's now in Carroll County. But absolutely, the York Road and the Old Frederick Road, all these roads. I mean, down the last slide I showed was the Queen. I forget now the Indian Queen Tavern in Bladensburg, and I was running out of time, so I didn't go into that. But bottom line is, all these routes are just chock full of taverns. They're more than you can imagine.
Sam, we see a lot of pictures depicting taverns with men in them. Was there any regulation prohibiting women?
I don't know there any regulation. I mean, I think a lot of, I mean, what artists did and what existed was by basically cultural norms of the era. And so it is interesting to see, particularly the artwork. There is a lot of art relating to taverns, wayside inns, and that could be a whole presentation or two itself. But it is fascinating to see how inns and taverns have been depicted in art over time, and what it shows.
Got another question here.
Two things. One, you guys from Reese, are you working on that building that's being restored right now? Is that an old tavern, do you know?
I don't know. It looks like one.
It does, it really does,
They're
yeah.
taking part of it down, but I don't know whether that's the original part that they're leaving or not.
Yeah,
And down in Carrollton,
yeah.
really old places.
It's cool. If you drive through Reese, you can see the work being done on that old stone building. It's quite interesting. It'd be interesting to see if it is a tavern. But I assume people were forced to drink whiskey or some of these god-awful things because there was no water, and if you drank water, you really were in peril. Is that true, Sam? And what do people drink after all these travels?
I mean, there was plenty, there was water, there certainly was water. There were wells, I mean, at Union Mills, there were multiple wells. I mean, that's fairly typical. There was water, came out of a well. I mean, it might not be always the best water, but aside from whether it was actually good or bad, there was literally a belief that it was healthier to drink spirituous liquors. These drinks were believed to be better for you. I mean, and if you got sick, they bled you. So, I mean, their ideas of medicine were not always very modern.
Sam, I have a question. I used to work at a place called the 2 Mile House. I think it was a tavern, but you mentioned something about a 3 Mile tavern. Is that something you've seen in research where they're meaning these things?
Absolutely. The Reisterstown Road had a tavern pretty much every mile called the 10 Mile House, the 7 Mile House.
Yeah.
And some of those structures still exist, absolutely.
Got a question here.
So you mentioned that people voted at the taverns, and we had a business in Baltimore, and as late as the 1960s, we were not allowed to sell beer on election day. I'm wondering if there's a correlation there, or is it?
Yeah. So again, I will apologize again. I know I had too much material for an hour presentation, and so I was shoehorning a lot of information in, and I took a lot out. There's a lot of legislation relating to liquor. I mean, the books are full of regulations, laws relating to liquor. Yes, there are lots of restrictions early on about when you could serve, and there are all kinds of rules about not serving alcohol on election day. That developed certainly in the 19th century and or after the Civil War at least. I saw some examples of that. So whether it was because you were voting in the taverns, I don't know, but that certainly makes sense.
Well, I'm glad we don't have it now, because I have to drink on election day.
Touche.
Part of that regulation is also because of the tradition of political candidates and parties applying to alcohol on election day.
That's what my guys used to tell me, was the walk around guys that were giving out miniatures. There's a theory that that's where the little miniatures originated. That's what they were handing out to people on election day and asking to vote for their candidate.
No pun intended, but last call, last call. Anyone? Thank you very much, Sam, for everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And a final plug, if you want to learn more, come out to the library at the Historical Society or one of these other groups and volunteer. They have so much information tucked away in their archives, waiting for volunteers to come help research and understand them. So, thank you.